You can't possibly expect me to pay for that, can you? The words hung in the sterile air of the hospital room, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something acridly familiar, entitlement. I turned my head slowly, the effort sending a fresh wave of pain through my chest. Across the narrow space, my sister, Sarah, was perched on the edge of the uncomfortable visitor's chair, her designer handbag clutched like a shield. Her expression was a carefully curated blend of concern and exasperated patience, the kind she reserved for particularly dim-witted customers at her boutique. Except I wasn't a customer, and this was not a minor inconvenience. This was my life, or what was left of it, laid out on a thin hospital mattress. My own life, before this week, had been a study in muted existence. I worked a quiet job, lived in a small but tidy apartment, and my social calendar rarely extended beyond weekly calls with my parents and the occasional coffee with a friend. It was a life built on routine, on avoiding friction, on a constant, low-level hum of appeasement. Sarah, however, operated on a different frequency. Her life was a dazzling, often chaotic, spectacle. Marriages imploded and were immediately reinflated with new, equally wealthy partners. Business ventures, fueled by a heady mix of charm and strategically deployed manipulation, soared and then, with equally spectacular drama, crashed. My parents, bless their weary hearts, had always been the anchors, the silent financiers of her whims, the keepers of the peace. I, the younger one, the responsible one, the one who never caused a fuss, was the quiet constant in their turbulent universe. I was the one who remembered birthdays, who showed up to help with their endless renovations, who listened patiently to their anxieties about Sarah's latest financial escapade. I was the steady hand, the one they could always count on, the one who asked for nothing in return. I remembered the incident with the antique vase. It had been a family heirloom, passed down from my grandmother. Sarah had been visiting, her eyes, sharp and acquisitive, immediately latching onto it. Within a week, she'd borrowed it, promising to have it professionally cleaned. It arrived back 2 months later, a hairline crack snaking across its delicate surface. When I'd gently pointed it out, her reaction had been pure theater. Tears, accusations of being overly sensitive, and a dramatic pronouncement that I was ruining her artistic vision. The vase, apparently, was meant to look weathered. My parents, predictably, had smoothed it over, offering to pay for an invisible repair, asking me not to make a fuss. I hadn't. The vase sat on my mantelpiece, a silent testament to the invisible cracks that ran through our family. Then there was the car. A minor fender bender, my fault. I'd been stressed, distracted. Sarah, who lived across town, had arrived at my apartment within the hour, not to offer comfort or help, but with a perfectly worded email drafted to my insurance company, outlining a convoluted scenario that somehow painted me as the victim of road rage and herself as the concerned sister who witnessed the entire, fabricated event. Her motive? To secure a higher payout, which she assured me would be split between us, of course. The extra money, she explained, was to compensate for my emotional distress. I deleted the email, paid the deductible myself, and the incident was never mentioned again, at least not directly. The ghost of her offer, however, lingered, a cold reminder of how she saw every interaction as a potential transaction. The incident that brought me here began with a persistent cough, a cough that refused to subside, that settled deep in my lungs and stole my breath. It escalated rapidly. One evening, I'd found myself gasping for air, my body racked with tremors. The paramedics had been efficient, their faces grim as they loaded me into the ambulance. I remembered fragments, the blare of the siren, the rhythmic thump of the engine, the concerned murmur of the nurse by my side. Then, the hushed tones of the doctors, the pronouncement of a severe pneumonia, the need for immediate hospitalization and extended recovery. I woke up in that room, feeling hollowed out, my body a landscape of aches and tubes. My phone buzzed incessantly on the bedside table. Texts from friends, colleagues. I'd managed to grasp it, my fingers clumsy and weak. The last missed calls were from my parents. I'd drafted a weak reply, explaining my situation. Then, Sarah's name flashed on the screen. I'd hesitated, then clicked. It was a voice note. Just checking in, her voice chirped, devoid of any warmth. Heard you're in the hospital. Listen, about that loan you promised to help me with for the new gallery space. I know you're not feeling well, but the investors are getting antsy. Could you transfer the funds by Friday? My accountant needs to finalize things. Just thought I'd remind you, no big deal. The voice note cut off, leaving me in a deafening silence. I stared at the wall, the sterile white mocking my growing sense of dread. The loan she was referring to was the substantial sum I'd painstakingly saved over years, a down payment for a small cottage by the sea, my quiet retirement dream. I'd mentioned it to my parents, who'd then, no doubt, mentioned it to Sarah. She, with her uncanny ability to sniff out opportunity, had immediately pivoted the conversation. She'd promised to invest it for me, to make it grow, a proposal I'd politely but firmly declined, citing my own plans. Clearly, she hadn't taken no for an answer. The door creaked open, and Sarah walked in, her usual whirlwind of perfume and expensive fabric. She surveyed the room, her nose twitching. Ugh, it's even worse than I imagined, she declared, her voice echoing. She didn't approach my bed, instead opting for the chair. She'd clearly arrived with an agenda, and my illness was merely a temporary inconvenience. So, she began, smoothing her skirt, about that money. The gallery needs it. And honestly, darling, you're going to be here for a while, right? This whole thing must be costing a fortune. It's probably best if I just handle it. For you. Save you the stress. She gestured vaguely at the medical equipment. You wouldn't want to be worrying about bills on top of all this. I looked at her, my breath catching. The carefully constructed facade of sisterly concern crumbled, revealing the sharp edges of her self-interest. My mind, usually a foggy mess when I was unwell, sharpened. The insult, the sheer audacity of her proposition while I lay here, vulnerable and fighting for breath, was like a physical blow. She saw my illness not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. I tried to speak, but a dry, rasping cough seized me. Sarah waved a dismissive hand. Oh, don't strain yourself. Look, I brought you some juice. Bottled, of course. Tap water in hospitals, you know. She placed a small, elegantly branded bottle on the bedside table, far out of my reach. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft whirring of machines. I met her gaze, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. The years of quiet endurance, of swallowing my resentment, of being the accommodating one, suddenly felt foolish. She expected me to capitulate, to be too weak, too grateful for her supposed help, to resist. She expected me to crumble. But something had shifted. The pain in my chest, the fear, the overwhelming vulnerability, it had stripped away the layers of my usual reticence. I saw her for what she was, stripped bare of her borrowed bravures. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this time, she would not win. The next few days were a blur of medical procedures and the slow, agonizing process of regaining my strength. Sarah visited sporadically, always with the same expectant, slightly impatient air. She never asked how I was, only how soon I could sort out the finances. My parents, when they finally visited, were a study in conflicted emotions. They were concerned about me, yes, but their conversations were peppered with anxious glances towards Sarah, as if waiting for her to orchestrate their reactions. They'd clearly been fed her version of events, a narrative where her financial struggles were a constant, insurmountable burden, and my supposed generosity was the only solution. One afternoon, a nurse entered my room, a stack of papers in her hand. "These need your signature, dear," she said kindly, placing them on my tray table. "Just standard discharge paperwork. And there's something else, about an outstanding balance we need to clarify." My heart gave a lurch. I knew, instinctively, that this was it. The culmination of Sarah's entitlement. I hadn't mentioned my savings, my cottage dream, to anyone except my parents, and then only in the vaguest terms of future plans. Sarah, with her uncanny knack for gleaning information and weaponizing it, must have gleaned enough. I looked at the papers. They were hospital bills, astronomical in their scope, detailing the cost of my intensive care, the medications, the long-term monitoring. Below them was another document, a loan agreement. A loan, for Sarah's gallery. It was meticulously drafted, with a repayment schedule that was laughably optimistic and an interest rate that was practically a gift. And my name was on it, as the sole guarantor. It was dated just a few days after my admission, signed with a flourish that I now recognized as unmistakably Sarah's. The betrayal was a cold, sharp shard piercing through my weakened state. It wasn't just the money, the jeopardizing of my future. It was the calculated cruelty, the exploitation of my vulnerability, the absolute conviction that I would meekly go along with her scheme. She had used my hospitalization, my very life, as leverage. I remembered her face that first day, the smug certainty in her eyes. She truly believed she had me cornered. But as I looked at the loan agreement, a different feeling began to bloom within me. Not anger, not despair, but a cold, quiet resolve. This wasn't about fighting. This was about dismantling. I asked the nurse for a pen, my hand trembling slightly as I held it. I signed the discharge papers, my signature firm and clear. Then, I turned to the loan agreement. I didn't cross it out. I didn't write void. Instead, with deliberate precision, I began to annotate. I drew a thick, red circle around Sarah's signature. Next to it, in block capitals, I wrote, without my knowledge or consent. Below that, I added, fraudulent document. Reported to hospital administration and legal counsel. I then meticulously detailed the date of my admission, my critical condition, and the fact that I was sedated and unable to make informed decisions. I wrote down the approximate date and time Sarah had visited, and her insistent requests for financial assistance, citing her voice note. I left no room for ambiguity. When Sarah arrived later that afternoon, ostensibly to help me pack, I was already dressed, sitting in a wheelchair in the hallway, the annotated loan agreement tucked neatly into my bag. My parents hovered nervously nearby. "Ready, darling?" Sarah chirped, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness. "I've got the car waiting. Though, honestly, you should really let me take you to my place for a few days. You'll need proper care." I met her gaze, and this time, there was no trace of the meek younger sister she'd always underestimated. "No, thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be going home. My own home." She blinked, her practiced smile faltering. "But, you can't possibly manage on your own yet." "And what about?" She gestured vaguely towards the stack of bills that were now being processed. Yes," I said, my voice dropping to a low, even tone. "The bills. And the loan." I reached into my bag and pulled out the annotated loan agreement. I held it up, letting the red ink stand out against the white paper. Sarah's eyes widened, her face draining of color. The casual arrogance vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. "What is that?" she stammered. "That," I said, my gaze unwavering, "is a document you attempted to have me sign while I was in a critical condition, incapacitated and unable to give informed consent. I've provided a copy to the hospital administration, and I'll be filing a police report for attempted fraud and exploitation of a vulnerable person. My lawyer will be in touch regarding any further discussions." The color had completely leached from her face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. My parents gasped, their eyes darting between me and Sarah. You can't," she finally choked out, her voice thin and reedy. "I was helping you. I was looking out for you." "Were you?" I asked, my voice soft but cutting. "Or were you trying to leverage my illness to fund your latest vanity project? I don't think the authorities will see it as helping, Sarah." The ensuing chaos was a symphony of Sarah's unraveling. Her frantic calls, her indignant texts, her attempts to rally our parents to her side. They, caught in the crossfire, wavered, torn between their ingrained habit of protecting Sarah and the stark reality of her actions. The hospital administration, presented with the irrefutable evidence and my detailed statement, acted swiftly. The fraudulent loan agreement was invalidated, and Sarah was informed that any further attempts to involve the hospital in her financial schemes would be met with legal action. My parents, faced with the stark truth and the potential legal repercussions for Sarah, finally began to see the extent of her manipulation. The fallout was swift and brutal. The whispers started first, then the outright accusations. Sarah's social circle, which had always been built on a foundation of mutual back-scratching and carefully curated appearances, began to distance themselves. Her investors for the gallery, alerted to the legal scrutiny, pulled out en masse. Her boutique, already teetering on the brink of financial disaster, finally folded. The carefully constructed image of the successful, charismatic businesswoman crumbled, revealing the desperate hustler beneath. I watched it all from a distance. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply observed the natural consequences of her actions. There was a quiet satisfaction, a deep sense of equilibrium restored, not through anger, but through cold, unassailable truth. My cottage by the sea, the one I'd dreamed of, was still within reach. My savings, though slightly depleted by my unexpected hospital stay, were intact. I'd learned a valuable lesson, not about the fragility of life, but about the destructive power of unspoken truths and the quiet strength found in finally refusing to be a doormat. Sarah's life, once a dazzling display, was now a quiet, lonely testament to her own avarice. And I, who had always lived in the shadows of her brilliance, finally found my own quiet space in the sun. The silence that followed her downfall was not an absence, but a presence, the solid, grounding presence of my own hard-won peace.